I'm curious if you have found being in an intercultural relationship, whether having that RLT lens just personally has been helpful to you. Has it been challenging to you?
I want to say it's been very, very helpful. However, the work is actually harder.
When you learned about it, did it help you reflect on how patriarchy has shown up in your life?
Absolutely. And I think that awareness initially, I want to say cost a lot of fighting even within myself. But once you come out the other side, it gets easier.
Hey, Veronica, how are you?
Hi, Bonnie. I'm doing well. Thank you. How are you?
Very well. I'm so glad that we're doing this today.
Same.
Could you start just by sharing anything that you'd like to about your background and your identities so that we know a little bit more about you?
I've been thinking a lot about this question, and I think I came to the conclusion that there's only one identity that I chose, and that's the identity of a mother. I recently gave birth to a baby girl, and that's something that I wanted, something that I chose, something that it was me. You know, when you're filling out forms and they ask you for your race, your ethnicity, all that stuff, I realized that the rest of my identities were given to me, meaning I recognized that I am in the body of an Asian woman. I didn't choose to be Asian. I didn't choose to be a woman. So it was a difficult, I guess, question for me to answer just because I notice how people look at me or I notice how people respond to me, but those are not identities that I chose. I just wanted to be human. And again, the only identity I chose is to be a mother. But to answer that question, I was born in Taiwan. I was raised in Ecuador. I've lived and worked in 4 to 5 continents. I lived in Germany for 10 years. And I've been in the US for close to 15 years now. So I'm kind of a citizen of Earth. Sometimes I think that's a confusing thing. Like sometimes when people ask me, where are you from or what are you? I say that I'm just confused because all these different cultures, like it becomes overwhelming to just kind of like categorize. And I speak 5 languages. So even talking to somebody in what seems to be the same language, I struggle with the interpretation of the same language even.
Can you give an example of that?
So my partner is Jewish American, cisgender male, Caucasian, and sometimes I'll say things, for example, in the kitchen even, right? He'll ask where something is, and I'll be upstairs, and we live in a 1-floor apartment. There's no upstairs. But for me, the upstairs means in a different language, it just means upstairs, right? So even those misunderstandings can cause fights just because he's not understanding me. I'm frustrated and I go down into shame, like, what's wrong with me? Am I not speaking good English, right? So that's a very small example. And it happens daily, but I've learned to ask rather than just kind of like go down into shame. Or I've also learned to laugh about it. But then sometimes I also go down into shame because I don't understand other people. So even within my culture, like I'm going to be very general, Asians pride on being very smart, right? Usually we're the ones good in math and science in school, right? So like when I get to a point where people don't understand me, I go down into shame and it's like, am I just dumb, right? So that's also a cultural thing that happens.
I'm curious how you found RLT and how you use it within your own life and your own relationship with your partner.
Right. So in going back to school to become a therapist, I think in the industry, you will hear or learn about RLT. And I think the first attraction towards it was how Terry talked about childhood and how that's reflected in your relationships. So it started out with childhood, but then I agreed with everything he was saying in terms of we are social creatures, right? And it talking about individual empowerment versus relational and the ecosystem. I'm a systems thinker as well. So all of that just kind of like pulled me in even closer. But it started out with childhood and how that comes up in like the adaptive child, right? How that comes up in our relationships. And most of us are running our lives in our adaptive child parts rather than in our wise adult self. I had some training in IFS, so I was also very familiar with like younger parts and then the wise adult self. So that's what kind of brought me into RLT. And I think I'm a Pisces. I was born in March, so just by nature I'm like a dreamer, and like I want to say hopeless romantic, but these days I'm more of a hopeful romantic. So I always wanted people to get along, and I always wanted people to be in love, not necessarily romantically, but just like live in love. Yeah, that's how I came to RLT, and I started kind of like, I guess, researching it or looking for it. And then at some point I got an email where Terry was filming that documentary with Michelle. So then I'm in Philadelphia right now. So that documentary was in New York. So I was like, I'm going to go check it out. And that experience kind of like solidified, me wanting to train in this and me just wanting to live that life relationally.
I'm curious if you have found being in an intercultural relationship, whether having that RLT lens just personally has been helpful to you. Has it been challenging to you?
I want to say it's been very, very helpful. However, the work is actually harder. So my partner and I, we have actually an RLT couples therapist. We actually started out with a therapist that was training Gottman method. And when I came to learn about RLT, I was like, I'm going to fire that Gottman therapist. I'm moving to RLT, right? Because I think I was missing the trauma component of it. I was missing like your adaptive child part and your wise adult, all of that I was missing. So I think in just studying it, it's helped in my relationship. However, in the work, because I come from a culture that is generally, up in grandiosity, I think, right? I think just because marginalized communities have to kind of, I want to say compete, but that's not the right word, but where it always feels like we're competing with a different race, a different gender. So because we're riding up in grandiosity, it was harder for me to be in healthy self-esteem or in healthy relationality. I was usually up in grandiosity or I came down into shame. So just doing that work for myself has been really, really, really hard.
When you learned about it, did it help you reflect on how patriarchy has shown up in your life?
Absolutely. And I think that awareness initially, I want to say cost a lot of fighting even within myself, because I had to relearn everything. I had to re-educate myself. And again, as an Asian person who culturally, right, we're like the smart ones, the ones that do math, science, engineering, whatever. I went down into shame really quickly because I was like, I don't get it. Am I just dumb, right? So it was a harsh awakening, I want to say, just because everything I've learned, everything I've been trained to do or trained to be, it was like, that's not relational, that's not healthy. And I was like, oh crap, right? So that awakening was in some ways the shadow, right? I had to do a lot of work with my shadow self. But once you come out the other side, it gets easier. I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't fight or get angry or go down in shame, but I'm able to kind of like recognize it faster and pull myself out of shame as well. And that also helps my partnerships, and not necessarily just romantically, but just in life.
How do you imagine it will influence your parenting?
Oh gosh. In my culture, I think there's something called filial piety. It's very ingrained where as a woman, you step down. As somebody younger, you step down. So there's a very clear order of where you stand. I'm the oldest of 5, so I have more power than my younger siblings, right? I'm a woman, so I have less power than a man. I'm Asian, so I have less power. So no matter how you stack it, I have less power than whoever, right? So I'm hoping that my daughter doesn't inherit that part of it. The hierarchical, like this is where you stand kind of thing. Because I recognize that she's Taiwanese Jew living in the US. And in our current political situation, there's a lot of discrimination, particularly with immigrants. And although she's a US citizen, she still looks different. So I'm hoping that I give my daughter enough skills to just kind of like be in healthy self-esteem. But unfortunately, I feel like I still have to teach her how to, I guess, defend herself when somebody mocks her about the size of her eyes. Even within my family, there's like, her eyes are a little slanted. Does that make her Asian? Right? Things like that. There's a lot of microaggressions that are happening that even within my inner circle, we don't realize it. So I have to be almost like hyper vigilant and hyper aware and hyper awake. So I'm able to kind of give her skills to, be in the world.
Well, it sounds like your work that you're doing and the work that you're doing with your partner is the recipe for handing her something quite different, at least within the four walls of your home. And as you're saying, there's always that societal piece, which, hopefully changes bit by bit, but we're not counting on it, that you're recognizing that she walks in the world and that she's going to be faced with some of that. And your awakeness to it then doesn't become complicit with it.
Yes. I mean, I've told my partner that I want the generational trauma piece to end with us. And it doesn't necessarily mean that she might not catch parts of it, just because that takes a long time to undo. And even if she is part of that generational trauma, it doesn't mean it has to be traumatic, right? Like, it's still, I want to be able to like talk to her about it, connect and be intimate that way. I don't want to completely deprive her of anything necessarily. I think that could be, negative consequences, so to speak. So I just, like with my partner and I tell them, let's work harder, right? Like, I recognize the patterns, let's say with my parents, I recognize the patterns with his parents. However, because he's not in the industry, in the mental health industry, I have to help them a little more, kind of like, hey, your mom is this way, you are this way with your parents. He tends to be more love avoidant, so I tend to have to tell them to come closer or lean in closer. But then in doing that, sometimes my boundarylessness is chasing him. So I also have to be aware that I don't fall into like old patterns. So it's a lot of work, and sometimes it's a lot of responsibility, just kind of like carrying that burden, maybe responsibility with the outside world.
Well, it's also kind of in a didactic way with your partner, creating a little bit of that appropriate discrepancy of, you want to be a good dad, and here's a little way that you could do that if you're open to it, which could, I understand, veer on boundarylessness, but it can also be just good old transmission reception work where you offer something and he's receptive to it because it matters to him and your values are aligned around how you want to raise her.
Yeah, so sometimes in adding that stress, I can go a little bit overboard. I can add the stress from a grandiosity space rather than a healthy space. So that's also something that I have to catch myself in. And because he's more love avoidant, it's almost like he won't deal with it, right? So I have to invite him to lean in. The discrepancy, it comes from like a grandiosity place, and that's hard for me, right? Because I never had that boundary set up for me growing up. Like, it was completely boundaryless. It came from like a violent energy rather than a loving energy. I've also learned to get things done or get people to respond that way, like almost from like a controlling, manipulative space. But because he's avoidant, I don't always know that I'm being violent or coming from a grandiosity place. So I've given him permission to like call me out on stuff. So that's been kind of like a dance that we do, but it takes more work for me to come down from grandiosity, as Terry says, because it feels good, right? So that's something.
Like you say, because it feels good, and also because your cultural teachings put you in a position of being the oldest of five and having that role. And I'm curious if you are talking to somebody outside of your culture, you think Taiwanese or however you want to think about this, who's working with somebody who grew up with some of those teachings in a very real way. I mean, all cultures are patriarchal, and then some have these added layers of rules around what your role is or what your position is. If you're talking to somebody who's out of that culture and they're working with clients who are within your culture. Would you have any thoughts about how they might do it effectively, or things to keep in mind when they're doing that out of cultural work?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to not come from, I want to say, Western mentality in terms of connection and intimacy. So the number one thing is come in knowing that you have no clue because it's very different. And the other one is always detached from the outcome, which is very hard because let's say if you are a white therapist working with an Asian couple, right? Like we know that certain levels of grandiosity is unhealthy. I mean, and I've caught myself doing that too because I was educated in a Western system, right? So I can come in telling them, oh my gosh, he's, being grandiose towards you. Speak up, right? So in session, I've caught myself doing that. And that impulse to almost rescue, right? I have to kind of like work on it, even as I am in the session, because I don't ever want any, let's say, Asian woman to feel less than or that they have to be submissive towards the man. But then if they don't bring it up in session, who am I to kind of like point that out to her? So it's very difficult for me to just kind of like address whatever it is that is in the room, whatever it is that they want to address, versus me trying to be like, he is in grandiosity, you are down in shame. How do we move closer to healthy relationships? Sometimes it's just like he stays in grandiosity, she stays down, one down. How do we make that work? So it's very difficult for me.
Yeah. So if you're working within your culture and you have a sense of your own tendencies, and you have a little bit of awareness or more awareness than somebody else might, you sound like you're tuned into what your growing edges are, or what's the thing you need to be aware of. But what you're saying for somebody who's coming from outside the culture is to not make assumptions about intimacy and closeness and not get too attached to the outcome, while also being effective. That they're hiring us for something. So there's that. In some ways, it sounds like taking your time, really understanding them before you start moving too quickly.
Yeah, definitely slow down.
Slow down.
Definitely slow down a lot. I work with some international couples where, sure, we speak English. However, our cultures are so different that I end up explaining terms to them, right? So I'm working with a Polish couple where the other day we were talking about the word enable. At first I was like, I'm going to use the word enable and, take it at face value. That's what it means. I explained it one time and it was still the transmission reception. It still needed more work. Then I had to kind of like take it down a notch. And I had to give examples. So I think that's the slowing down and that's the patient part that comes in. But that happens with couples that are in the same culture anyway.
It does. But it really does speak to how language is fairly vague and inaccurate, depending on your own way of using the words, or somebody coming on this being their second or their third language. And then not everybody speaking the same language is necessarily saying the same thing. And yes, that can happen with two people from the same culture, and more likely to happen if you have a mixed cultural couple or if you are working across cultures as a practitioner.
So I'm also part of like different affinity groups within the RLT community. And I'm in the Spanish speaking one where we meet, I think it's every 2 weeks. And we spend a lot of time just translating. It's hard to translate verbatim one up and one down, for example, like culturally, how do you say one up, one down? And even if you get the words to be exactly what they mean, the meaning behind it, it's just like, it makes no sense. So growing up in Ecuador and born in Taiwan and, living in the US and Germany and all that stuff, there are cultures that are actually very macho, meaning male dominant. How do I correct that? Like, it's not my job to say, hey, we're equals. For example, in Ecuador, right? Like, it's something that has to be corrected. I have to respect that in that culture, a man has more worth than a woman, for example, right? So those are things that are very difficult to just kind of like come into the room or the work that we're doing and not criticizing or judging an entire people, right? So that's tough, I think.
Well, I'm guessing that when you do meet people, anybody, when you meet a couple, there's the rub between them that brought them there in the first place. So if they had no problem with it at all, they wouldn't be there seeing you, or that wouldn't be the issue that they were bringing up. If one of them is bringing up, then you have that acculturation issue where one person wants change and the other person is a little bit more content with it.
Yeah. And I think in my own personal life, right? Like I remember I wasn't interested in therapy. However, my partner being American, right? Like therapy is more accepted. So he had to bring me into therapy, even though at some point I wanted to be a therapist. I guess it's a little bit of shame or embarrassment that people go into therapy because there's something wrong with them. So I also had to work through that, like asking for help or being vulnerable. None of those things mean weakness, but the cultural piece has been really hard to even adjust. And now that I'm kind of like living or trying to live more relationally every day, when I am with my family, it's very different. I almost give up on trying to be relational with them because it's not a thing that they're interested in. However, how do I still spend time with them in a way that it's relationally enough for me? So most of the time, I just look like I'm silent, quiet, and agreeable. But deep down, I'm doing a lot of like relational work, even within myself. Like, how do I have a better relationship with myself and with them, knowing that they don't want change or nothing needs to be changed even.
So a lot of those changes are more internal. How do I choose when and with who I actually dig into the relational work? And when am I kind of observing it or noticing it without getting too attached to it, but allowing myself to still be in that space? Is that right?
That is correct. That's from my perspective. But from the outside perspective, I've been called lazy, that I don't have an opinion, right? Because they're expecting a certain level of, I guess, interaction where it looks more like in grandiosity at times. So I'm also very aware that those are triggering, I guess, expectations, like the judgment and criticism. But in the past, it was kind of like I wanted to confront. And now it's more like, okay, how do I bring that power and energy back within myself? And how do I just stay in healthy relationship with myself rather than try to change an entire people?
I think you've hit on something really important with practitioners who are not in the culture. Do not make an assumption that your quietness or your choice not to confront that is in some way going one down. It sounds like you're actually making a choice from a wise adult position of this isn't the relationship that I'm going to work on. And I know what's happening. And I'm just thinking that somebody from outside the culture might be saying what Terry has traditionally said, blood speaks to blood, and your relationship is the primary unit, and how do you deal with the in-laws? But what you're talking about is really a slightly different piece to that, which is sometimes I'm going to make peace with what my family of origin offers without needing to do too much with it, but notice it.
Yeah. And also, how do I respect that culture? Right. It's very hard because I find a lot of, I want to say issues, but I also am learning to respect that culture for those issues. So how do you respect the culture that fundamentally you kind of disagree with? It's been hard to be in this body and then be okay in that culture because there's the hierarchy where you're like almost worthless, right? I think I'm working towards that. How do I respect somebody who I disagree with? How do I respect a culture that makes my skin crawl, right?
In some ways, it sounds like you've done the relational reckoning question, which is, am I getting enough out of being in this family culture to make up for what I'm not getting out of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought of it that way. And getting to a point of like, how do I not change it? Yeah, change my relationship towards that thing that I can't change. I think Terry's talked about it in terms of like self-esteem. A situation might be hopeless, but it's not serious. And that's been hard for me to swallow, like hopeless, but not serious. I'm like, what? Of course it's serious, right? This is my family. These are my relationships. Because there's that feeling of like leaving people behind.
Right. And also the hope of within our home, we're co-creating something that comes from a different model. And that's what we're passing along to our daughter, perhaps with some of the influences that you love about your culture, but leaving some of the aspects that you don't love at the door. You sound like such a gift to her.
Thank you. I also do want to share from just my experience in all these different groups that I'm in, and maybe outside of RLT as well. Somehow I've already accepted that I'm the truth teller, and somewhere I've also accepted that that advocacy that I want, I guess, my daughter or other women like me. In a lot of ways, I feel like the pioneer, and it's exhausting, right? But I think that's part of the work. How do I, not go down into shame and stay in one down my whole life, but bringing myself up a little bit, but not as high up in grandiosity. So I'm trying to, in terms of like one down and one up, I think I've been writing more in one up, but I have to watch how much higher I go. But it's been exhausting. There are times when I'm like, I don't really care to be relational, right? But that's the call, like for those of us in the industry, that's the call, to step up or to do more in our current political and cultural situations. Even with my daughter sometimes. Right now, she is boundaryless, and that's expected, right? When I catch myself losing that patience or that love for her, just kind of like, how do I stay in healthy self-esteem, right? And how do I contain that frustration that I have with myself so she doesn't pick up that, oh, my mom hates me kind of thing. It's a struggle every day, even within like the purest form of love that I have right now, which is with my daughter. Yeah.
Well, I think it speaks to the different parts of our brain and the whoosh that comes up so much faster, and the patience and the pause that it takes to get into the wise adult, and also holding those around you accountable, including our community, accountable to continuing to do the work to even it up a little bit, because you're talking about within a relationship with a daughter, a relationship with a partner, but you're also speaking in a lovely way about our relationships with one another as we build this community. I just can't thank you enough for all of that. Well, I thank you so much for everything. I could listen to you forever.
I wanted to do this interview with my daughter here because I body wear her a lot. Like she sleeps on me, and I hold meetings with her, like with classmates, even like my individual therapy and our couples therapy. I'm body wearing her, like she's part of it. But right now she's with her dad. So.
Oh gosh, I bet she's beautiful.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Well, she's got a great name too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Veronica.
You're welcome.